Thank you, Craig, for that introduction, and thank you all for joining. And I would like to thank the organizers for having invited me to this forum. In some senses, and Craig and I sort of talked about this in the past few weeks, I'm not sure whether I work with humans or animals or what level of the development spectrum I'm in. And so I thought I'd spend maybe 25 or so, 25, 30 minutes talking about, based on some of the things Craig mentioned that I've been up to, talking about where I think development has brought us in the last 50 years, and then being bolder still by talking about where I think our field, and I mean that in the best sense, is headed. The reason I thought I'd do that is because one of the thoughts I have, half-baked, but I'm hoping that you will help me think these issues through, is that there is now, and we saw this in spades in the panel just finished, that there's now a great opportunity to bring together the different ways in which we all think about and do development. And that is especially the case in bringing together the sciences and the social sciences. And that's one of the central things I learned from my wonderful years at IDRC, and which I hope to take with me wherever I go. What I thought I'd do is spend a bit of time on the last 50 years in a very broad brush manner, and then focus a bit on the last 10 or 15 years, in other words, the era of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and then spend some time on what this all means for our profession. Before I get to the slides, and I don't have very many, and they're only indicative, my opening point would be that the last 50 years of development is a success story. That we should be proud of what the world and what developing countries and by themselves especially, but also in partnership with each other and with others, have achieved. And there's different ways of looking at this, and this isn't to say that the development story is now over and we can all go home, nor is it to say that cooperation needs to end, far from it. But I do think we have to recognize that we've come a long, long way. And if we situate this in some kind of economic history, the fact that strikes me the most is that if you take Great Britain it took Great Britain after the Industrial Revolution about 150 years to double per capita output. It took the US about 50 years to double per capita output after its industrial stage at the start of the last century. It has taken the newly industrialized countries and China and India 20 years to double per capita output. And at the time that the UK and the US achieved their impressive goals, they had populations of about 10 million people each. The populations of China and India are about 1 billion each. And if you add the other newly industrialized countries, that's another half a billion to 1 billion. So I think both the size and scale and depth and magnitude of the transformation that we have seen is quite impressive. Now, this is not the same that this is not the same as saying there haven't been challenges. But it's interesting to think about what some of those challenges are. One of those, and you all would know much more about this than I do, is the emergence of non-communicable diseases. Sometimes they're called middle-class diseases, but the fact is there's a whole new dimension to the health issue in many developing countries. And that's, in my view, a sign of progress. I mean, it's a different scale of diseases. These are not diseases related to abject poverty. They're actually diseases about becoming prosperous, but becoming prosperous unevenly, if you will. The same can be said about some of the points we now make, which we wouldn't really have made 20 or 30 years ago, about the quality of universities in developing countries. And more of them are creeping up into the international rankings of universities, although we still decry, and especially people who send their children to these universities, decry the quality of these universities. But in my view, This is again a sign of prosperity and rising expectations, and not a sign of failure and stagnation. And all of you can think of episodes of this kind. The other way we can think of success is the emergence of the emerging powers. There isn't a problem in the world today, be it finance, be it Iran, be it North Korea, in which an emerging country is not seen as an integral part of the solution and is brought into that discussion as an equal, or almost as an equal. They're not afterthoughts, they're not resentfully brought in, but we absolutely see the world, and the G20, the creation of the G20 in 2008, is one more manifestation of this, the fact that global governance is now the purview of a larger and more inclusive group of countries than ever before. Now there are exceptions, and I will sort of mention four. The first is obviously all the increases that we have seen on the income and social development side disappear in war-torn regions. There's no question that in war-torn regions there is regression in many of these indicators, but also that these indicators bounce back once war is over. And so we cannot forget the importance of dealing with conflict and all of the negative ramifications of having persistent conflict. The second, and on this I am no expert at all, but I'm struck by the fact that indicators of well-being in many parts of the former Soviet Union are actually becoming worse. Life expectancy and morbidity rates of all kinds are becoming worse in the former Soviet Union. There's something that has to be unpacked there, and as a development profession we haven't fully understood that, but we need to understand that when countries radically implode and change their systems, these things do happen. The third, yes, but, would be the inequality issue. And on this, maybe it's because of my training, but I tend to be more optimistic than I suspect many of you might be, in the following sense. There is no question that in many growth phases, inequality worsens. China has become, and as has India, has become much more unequal in the last 20 years than it ever was. And in some ways, Chinese inequality is approaching Brazilian levels, Latin American levels. And keep in mind that 20 and 30 years ago, Latin America was the poster child of inequality of all kinds. But the good news is that Latin America, which has also been growing and growing quite impressively in the last 10 or 20 years, has been showing decreases in inequality. And so the lesson I take away from all of this is that if you grow and liberalize and all of that, there are actually policy options out there which can either make inequality, in other words, as a policy choice. There are options out there that can allow you to become more equal, and they come with their own costs and benefits, and there are options out there which allow you to become less equal. And so how we treat the combination of social and economic policy and social safety nets and the strength of our institutions is hugely important. And that's the lesson I take away from the whole inequality issue. And the final point on which I suspect one has to be very modest is that in almost every case, and I'll get to my slides in a second, environmental quality has worsened almost around the world. And so this is the flip side to all of the success and everyone producing more and consuming more, about which we need to become much more serious than we have been. And I'll have a couple of things to say about that. But the point I'm making is that the real challenge today and in years to come is not inequality in incomes or inequality even in opportunity. It is actually inequalities in capacity. And to illustrate that, I'd sort of move to my first slide, which actually has two pictures. They're both indicative. They're kind of cute, but in their own way, they illustrate what I want them to. The first is a view from space of a composite of different parts of the world taken at the same time at night. I believe it's 1 a.m. Simply to show you where the lights shine. And I suspect the people in the previous panel would have much more to say about this. But if you at all assume that the level of electricity is a very good indicator of all kinds of growth and well-being, then that first top slide still tells you that the lights are on in the places of the world where you would expect them to be on. And that there are huge parts of the world where, not just because of population density, but even otherwise, there is, in fact, a lot of challenge still. But the other interesting thing about that slide is take a look at the lights in Asia and East Africa and Latin America. They're becoming on too, and I'd suspect if we had this kind of photo from 15 years ago and 15 years hence, that's what would be the trend in all of these. But the other and more troubling indicator of inequality and opportunity is the inequality in different kinds of capability to analyze problems and to do science. This still tends to be the monopoly of the West, of rich countries, with some exceptions. If I were giving this talk 20, 25 years ago, it would have been a very simple story. North versus South. The scientific progress measured however was happening in the North, and the South was lagging. The more recent story is a slightly more nuanced version. It's one in which more and more of the science and inquiry is happening in developing countries, but not enough of it. So one of the measures that we use is GERD, gross expenditure in R&D, and this 42% or so of the total spending on research and development is globally is in North America. Another 22% is in Japan and the newly industrialized countries, and less than 1% is centered in sub-Saharan Africa, and the balance, of course, would be Europe. If you look at science publications, it's much the same. About 42% of science publications are authored by nationals of North American countries, 8% from Japan and the NICs, and less than 1% sub-Saharan Africa. And if you go to patents, which in some senses is an indicator, if you will, of future prosperity, then 50% in North America, 25% in the NICs and Japan, and less than 0.1% in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think if you really want to look at what is the inequality that we should all be concerned about, in my view, it is doing something about those. And so that brings me to my second. That's cuter still. It's a representation of the world using a composite of these measures of science. Instead of landmass, if we could project the world using indicators of science, what would it look like? And what you find is a very bloated North America, a very bloated Europe, a quite bloated Japan, and then Africa and Latin America and most of South Asia kind of disappear and become thin lines. And so in many ways, and there's different ways to look at this. The price of connectivity relative to income is much higher in developing countries than it is in developed countries. And what I draw from this is that capacities to systematically analyze and tackle problems is much lower in the developing world, and that is where the action in some ways needs to be. What else do we know? If I move from that very broad brush of the last 50 years to the last 10 or 15 years, we've been coalescing around something called the Millennium Development Goals. And as you all would know, there's about 8 of them, and they cover everything from health, education, nutrition, to the environment, and then the 8th goal on global governance. And the point was that at the turn of the century, the world's leaders signed on to a global compact. They signed on to a compact that said that we would do various good things. We would have levels of hunger and we would have levels of illiteracy by 2015, and at that point we would see what's next. And so we're now in the middle of 2014, and it might be a good time to see where we are. And so let me just quickly run you through where I think we stand on the MDGs. The first one looks at the first MDG, cutting poverty by half. And what matters here isn't the detail. I want you to look at 2 things. One is the color. This is color-coded, green, yellow, and red. Green shows absolutely on target to meet or exceed. Yellow shows kind of on target, and red shows really not going to make the target. And the size of the bubble is weighted by population. And that's important because although it's good to talk about global goals, it's also good to know, well, what's the source of the good news or bad news? And so what I take from this kind of chart is that however we do in the MDGs, a lot will depend on how things go in Asia. I mean, the big bubbles by population, that's where the world's population is, that's what the world's poor population is. And when it comes to simply poverty defined as less than $2 a day, Asia's doing okay, Latin America's kind of doing okay, and there are pockets that persist in West Asia which are not, and I'll come back to that in a second. If we look at the one on reducing hunger by a half, more or less the same story. Some impressive greens, some troubling yellows, and a red in West Asia. West Asia is sometimes what we call Central Asia and parts of the Middle East as well. Achieving universal primary schooling, more modest. Very few parts of the world going to meet that target, except perhaps South Asia. Women's equal representation in Parliament as one of the many indicators of progress on the gender front, not very good at all. Maternal health, a mixed bag, but again, Asia continuing to sort of show the way, not least because of changes in improvements, I should say, in China and India, and then a bunches of reds and oranges. And then the one that, in my sense, is the most troubling, also because this is an indicator of future capacity to produce and consume. It's not clear how one defines all of these MDGs, and that's one of the criticisms of them. But if you look at this, and if you simply look at forest cover and where it was supposed to be as opposed to where it's going to be, even, or I should say, especially in the areas that have been doing really well on all the other MDGs, not doing so well when it comes to environmental sustainability. And there might well be, as you would have guessed, a connection there. And that's the end of my slides. So I guess the point I'd make to summarize this section is that how we do globally will depend a lot on how we do in the populous parts of the world. But there are important pockets of the world which are not populated, where we're not doing that well, and we can't, as a community, forget that either. The second point I would make is that we've done better on the economic and money metric indicators of progress than we have on the more, perhaps the softer indicators, no less important, but the environment, quality of your institutions, the inclusion of women in power and politics, that kind of thing. And the final point on that 8th MDG, on a new way to do things, it's difficult to understand who would not sign on to that, because it's difficult to measure either, and that's something I'm going to come back to, is I think the links between global governance and development have become tighter, but it's not clear to me where this is all headed. The MDGs have been criticized for many things, and I'll mention some of them, but overall it is the only game we had, and probably still do, where everyone comes together and says, what kind of world do we want to live in? Everyone, as in officials and people in power, and I make that important distinction, not civil society necessarily, not the universities, but leaders, political leaders come together and then sign on to these things. What's missing? The main critique of the MDGs has been that they're all about what used to be called in our field basic needs, that they're all about doing minimal things like reducing poverty by a half, and reducing hunger by a half. But there's nothing terribly aspirational here. There's also nothing about growing the pie. This is all about dividing up the pie more fairly without a recognition that one has to be growing a pie, and when you're growing a pie, it's a lot easier. Back to my point about Latin America, it's a lot easier to be talking about dividing the pie. So I think it's probably not the right way to approach things if we don't see growth and its division at the same time and concentrate only on the division of growth. There's nothing in the MDGs about security, either personal security or broader versions of it. There's nothing in the MDGs about freedom, transparency, and openness. And there's nothing in the MDGs about innovation, R&D, and all the things that make this campus and mine and others tick, all the things that in some ways are leading indicators of growth and a good life many years down the road. The other point I'd make before moving on to what the future might hold is that the result, the progress, and I come back to my point that this is mainly a success story, that the progress we have seen is not the result of a single-minded application of a common set of policies. If you look simply at the way how South Korea and Malaysia and Chile have industrialized, and more recently how India, China, and Brazil are doing, not to mention South Africa, it is the case that there has been a heterogeneous use of policies. There has not been a common orthodoxy, much less a common liberalization that has prevailed while all of these quite impressive gains were being made. And that's a challenge. It's especially a challenge to the West if you at all believe that somehow the good ideas and the resources resided here and all we had to do was export them and apply them elsewhere, which in many ways has been one of the ways in which foreign aid and foreign cooperation has been happening. If that's how we saw it, then the current success is simply not a result of that. The second aspect, which in some ways is striking, is that the mix of finance, which is driving all of this success in many countries, has changed radically. Foreign aid never, by the way, accounted for a large proportion of government spending, but it is now the smallest tranche in it. What you find is that personal remittances have become increasingly major factors in foreign inflows into developing countries. Private investment, both direct investment, meaning in plants and factories and so on, as well as so-called portfolio investment, is important. And most important, own resources. Local savings and investing has always been the driver of these things, and it's the case even more now. So you have a story in which there's success around the world. It cannot be said to be because this success followed a certain path set elsewhere. And the finance for a lot of the success is no longer in public and in government hands. So that's where we find ourselves in some senses today. What might, and here I'm becoming more and more heroic in some ways, so I'd welcome your views, but what might the next 50 years mean for development? The most striking fact about developing countries today and in future is the emergence of an absolutely definable and recognizable middle class. When you have a large middle class, this isn't just an economic phenomenon, it's actually a political and social phenomenon, because you have people who don't see themselves as poor and deserving. You have people who aspire to more and more things and have more and more demands of their institutions and their governments and their neighbors and everyone else. And that's a completely different dynamic than one we might have seen in developing countries 20, 30, and 50 years ago. The UN estimated a while back that if you define, as most institutions do, the middle class as people who can spend between $10 and $100 a day, then between 1990 and 2010, the share of the global middle class living in developing countries increased from 26% to 58%. In other words, there are more middle class people living in developing countries today, almost 2/3, than there are in developed countries. By 2030, that number will rise to 80%, and 70% of middle class spending will emanate from developing countries. And so in some ways this is a quite radical shift, not just, as I say, for people who make consumer goods and all the rest of it, although that's an important symbol of prosperity and feeling good about yourself, but it also has to do with the way expectations are set. And if we want to understand developing countries in future, we're going to have to understand their huge and important middle classes which are connected with each other. The other point I'd make looking ahead is about spillover effects. And this is where I think the development agendas and the global governance agendas and the international relations agendas are in fact coming together. The example I might give you, and there are several, is from the financial crisis that began in 2008. By all accounts, this is a crisis that began in the US and then moved into Europe, where there were, as you know, a series of shaky financial systems reliant on instruments that we hadn't fully understood, that resulted in an implosion in the financial sector, spread quickly to national economies, and has shaved many, many points of the growth rates in all the countries that we thought were emerging. China down from 12-ish to about 7%, India down from 8 and 9% to 4 or 5%, and indeed most of the developing world dragged down as a result. More recently, in the last 6 months or so, when the US Fed announced that it was going to ease off on quantitative easing, which was its way of putting money into the system to keep the financial system afloat, that led to a series of currency crises in developing countries, which had become used to money flowing into these countries because there was all this money sloshing around. My point is that growth rates in developing countries have been hugely responsive to events completely outside their control, or mostly outside their control, and in fact emanating in the West. And if you read on the climate change front, some of the reports of the Stern Commission and the IPCC and so on, it's much the same story, that the major impacts of climate change will of course be felt around the world, but they will especially be felt in developing countries. And so the internet, the same thing, that what happens in one part of the internet quickly spreads around the world. And so with globalization has come disconnectedness, which makes the global governance agenda at least as important as what I would have called in my former job the pure development agenda. That means that we're going to have to place a premium on the kinds of negotiations we need to stabilize financial systems, to stabilize carbon emissions, to create an internet that everyone buys into and feels ownership of. And these are all classic global public goods. We don't necessarily have the structures for them in place in many cases. But the fact is, interconnectedness means if you want to do something really useful for the developing world, stabilize global finance. Create an internet that is both secure as well as controllable in some ways. Do something about climate change. And I do think in this sense, we need to understand in the developing world that tackling poverty will often mean getting things right at levels that we hadn't always understood to be the case. The last point I'd make on this side is that in keeping with my point that countries have not become rich by following a common agenda or common formula, that we need to keep space for countries to experiment and do their own thing. And the classic debate between what role the government has in regulating or creating markets and what role the markets have in running themselves and not having government regulate them is a balance that's being struck completely differently. I was struck in the previous panel where a speaker said that if you want to get published what you pay right, you have to operate differently in different countries. And in this country, because we don't have a common securities regulator, you have to be working at the provincial level. That's true of Canada, that's true of many countries, and no one's going to say to Canada, therefore you must. I mean, Canada will do it when we are ready to move to a different regime of securities regulation. In the meanwhile, those of us working on the policy and advocacy side have to recognize this and understand it and work within that parameter. It's the same in developing countries. They have different constitutional arrangements, they have different institutional processes, and we're simply not going to be able to say, other than at the broadest level, what the rules of the game will be. We can certainly sign on to targets. We cannot be telling countries how to achieve those targets, in other words. What might this all mean then for the way we organize ourselves? I guess, again, I would leave you with a more or less optimistic message, which is that if we want to have a global governance system that is also developmentally oriented, then we need a table around which all the key players are. The MDGs, or whatever follows them in 2015, is one such. And the other is, and we already have it, it might not be fully functional, but we do have the G20. The G20 was created in crisis in 2008 and includes all the major countries that you would expect to be part. There are some gaps in it, notably the absence of Nigeria and Egypt. That, in principle, is easily remedied. But if you agree that, in the absence of anything else, this is as good as it gets, we do have the global forum to deal with the kinds of problems that I have been talking about. In addition, since we know that good ideas don't reside even in the G20, what do you do about the middle-income countries, Malaysia, Chile, that have impressive stories to tell? What do you do about the small island states, which will be hugely affected by things in climate change? What do you do about the emergence of global private philanthropy, which is a major factor not just among Western-based philanthropists, but increasingly philanthropists in developing countries themselves? There's different ways to address that, and that's part of what makes working at CG exciting, the fact that we're often thinking about these things. One of the fixes I've heard is to make the G20, which currently is accountable to no one and is kind of self-appointed, in some senses connected more to the UN system and maybe have it report back to the UN General Assembly, so that you have this bicameral system in which not only do you have weighted representation, but then you also have the pure democracy, one country, one vote. There's different ways to look at it, but there's no question that you do need a small table that can get things done, but that small table has to represent the voices and the aspirations of people beyond the small table. And that's really the big challenge where, in my view, global governance and development come together. And if they do, then I do think we will be able to tackle not just the remaining issues in poverty and deprivation, but more importantly, in the innovative capacity, which is what I began by saying was the big disequalizer at present, but needn't be forever. We'll stop there.